Kia ora koutou. I'm Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. This is a channel all about well-being and activism. And one of the things that I'm hoping to do more and more of is invite all the cool people that I know to come and talk about stuff that I don't know so much about. And today I've got one of my friends and cool people, Ahi, come to talk with us about their thoughts on well-being and activism. And I think it's going to have quite a focus on safer spaces, but could go all over the place. So welcome, Ahi. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy work to chat with me today.
Yeah, kia ora. Thanks for having me on. Um, it's nice to hang out and talk with people that you really like. And I love it when you don't have to start necessarily with 101 um, as well. That's something that I was thinking about coming here because, I do a lot of work. I'm not here on behalf of any workplaces or anything, but I do a lot of work that's educating. Can you hear my mic okay?
Yeah, I can. You're a little bit soft,
Sometimes
but yeah, I can.
yeah, I'm a little bit sick, so I'm a
Yeah.
little bit quiet. Um, but I do a lot of work that's educating, and quite often in different settings. But a lot of it is with like healthcare providers,
Mm.
and if when you go into a room of 30 different GPs or nurse practitioners or whoever, and usually I would be doing educating about trans healthcare. And you have to start off with the assumption that even though some people in the room will know a lot more,
Mm.
that there will be people in the room who, they're like, oh, I've never had a trans patient that I know of, or, or don't know you want to start off from 101. So
Yeah.
that's totally fine, and that's like 100% what you're there for, to like,
Mm.
that's, but then
Mm.
I guess it's quite nice, when you step out of doing that, and you can start with, you don't have to explain things from the beginning, kind of thing.
For
That
sure.
was a very long way of saying
Yeah,
thanks
yeah.
for having me on the show.
No, it's cool. I like it because I think that's so true for so many of us, though, is a lot of people's work is that kind of conversation. And yeah, that's what I like about being able to have a chance to have these conversations as well, to go a bit deeper for the people who are really pretty in it and thinking about this stuff. So where would you like to start today with thinking about, we did start talking about like maybe a safer spaces kind of focus. And the reason I asked you if you'd be interested in talking about that is in some ways I feel like safer spaces is like, it's something that gets talked about a lot, but not everyone necessarily takes the time to practically put that into our collectives or into our spaces or whatever. And I feel like you're somebody who's really thought about that and done that and had experience with it in a way that I haven't. Um, yeah, and sort of the cultures that we create in our movements make or break a lot of the time whether we can actually be effective, So, or stay in the work. So,
Yeah, it's like that kind of stuff kind of sets the foundation or something, eh? Like it decides who gets in the room in the first place,
mm,
to start working on whatever the project is that you're working on, or whatever it is that you're doing.
yeah,
Um, I've been thinking a little bit about how you have safer spaces policies,
mm,
and then you have like non-discrimination policies, and then you have diversity and inclusion policies, and
mm,
they're all sort of the same thing, but
mm,
with a slightly different focus, or slightly different groups tend to use them.
mm,
And and it's like safer spaces is pretty explicitly leftist, and it's usually feminist or anarchist, or like sort of towards the radical left side, and kind of like explicitly critiquing power or power over relationships, and kind of yes, like trying to name the dynamic between possibly sometimes just two groups of people, um,
mm,
and and there's a lot that's good about coming into it from just a let's look at power.
yeah,
Um, and then there's also bits that can fall off where like definitely a lot of safer spaces stuff I've been involved in has been very focused on um, like safety for women, and I think by default though that's usually been safety for cis women.
Mm.
And even if it's tried not to just be that, it's quite often, if that's who's creating it, then of
Mm.
course it's going to send to those concerns.
Yeah.
And and then and then it doesn't really situate that maybe those cis women are also Pākehā, and they're also, they're not disabled and they're New Zealand citizens, and
Mm.
their safety concerns are, a really specific type of
Mm.
concern. And then I was thinking how, well, in comparison, and what I probably what I mostly do these days is more like non-discrimination policy sort of stuff,
Mm.
which is a little bit, it's not explicitly leftist necessarily, or it doesn't
Mm.
have to be. And then you're working on a framework more of like looking at minority groups, like protected minority groups. So it's more like looking at the legal framework, or like within
Mm.
the human rights law type of framework. So, who are the minority groups who have like protected minority status,
Mm.
and uh, kind of, so it is still naming a power relationship,
Mm.
but it doesn't tend to focus very much at all on who is in the up position. It focuses on
Right.
who's in the disparity. Doesn't focus on who's the dominant group. It just focuses on, getting more equity into the group that's the minority group.
Right. Right. So that look.
And
So can you give me a little bit of example or flesh that out a little bit? Like, so it's less about the
yeah,
behavior
yeah,
of the people who hold power and more about um,
yeah. So kind of
yeah.
recognizing structural, and it does tend to be more focused on like where people are being structurally disadvantaged,
Hmm.
and that sort of thing.
So
And then actually maybe I'll
material.
just like touch on the third thing, and then
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
go
Sure.
like
Sure.
what goes into all of them.
Yeah. Sure.
Because the other one is like diversity and inclusion policies, and I
Mm.
feel like that's a hot topic at the moment.
Mm.
And I think like there's a lot of sort of commercial groups who are like, oh, this is the thing now.
Mm.
Everybody's suddenly an expert on diversity and inclusion,
Hmm.
and that,
Like going in for pay and taking workshops kind of thing. Is that what you mean?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Like, I'm a diversity and inclusion expert who
Mm.
provides workshops for your workplace, or
Mm.
that kind of thing. So it's usually a bit more of a commercial kind of application, and but also, and it can be like it's a strengths-based approach to, instead of saying anti-discrimination, we're against the bad thing, they're
Yeah.
saying, well, we're for diversity and inclusion. It's
Yeah.
strengths-based,
Right.
which in theory, like in some ways, I think, strengths-based work is really important and good, but
Mm.
I also think it can be a bit fluffy. Like it can
Hmm.
kind of be a way of like, let's not name the actual power structures and the harm that's happening,
Yeah.
and just talk about how we want everyone to be equal, um,
Mm.
which I think, as a
Can get
side
really
note, I think
blurry in how
it's,
that actually plays out, eh?
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yes, and there are there are side rant groups who are white supremacist groups and run like family events about strengthening families and celebrating culture. It's just that they're talking about
Mm.
that in a way that's quite different from what would actually be good.
Mm. Yeah, for
So
sure.
it's,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think sometimes that like naming the bad thing is actually a really important part of getting to where things should be.
That's such a good point. Mm.
Mm,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I was kind of thinking about how uh, um, you know, when anything's designed, like what I was saying before about like if you defaultly have a group that is mostly, say, you know, Pākehā, cisgender women
Mm.
developing a policy,
Mm.
then they're going to be at the centre of it,
Mm.
and they might not be aware that there are margins of that where other people are, and um, and in any case, if it's built around them at the centre, then it's their needs that are going to be the most supported by that policy.
Mm.
And I guess when you go outside of, and if you're looking at like, oh, this is a, you know, this is a, you know, an activist group that does something quite specific, and it might
Mm.
be, you know, we have, I don't know, let's say crochet evening.
Mm.
Let's say we have crochet evening.
Yeah.
Um, then maybe building something around your very specific needs for a small group is totally okay.
Mm.
But then if you're doing something broader, um, I think sometimes the same thing happens though, even in like bigger structures or organisations, or yeah, and I mean I guess like that that the people who are developing the safer spaces or the, you know, diversity and inclusion or
Mm.
non-discrimination policy or however can centre themselves
Mm.
accidentally.
Mm.
Um, and then I guess also outside of like it's an activist type setting and into say it's public healthcare or it's housing.
Mm.
So
Mm.
you know houses are built with nuclear Pākehā families in mind, and
Yeah.
they're perfect for two people who work full time, and there's 2.5 children,
Yeah.
and no grandparents and no cousins, and you know they
Yeah.
work they work fine for that. You know, and it's sort of
Yeah.
like, and I guess how society is structured. I mean, I guess how that dynamic works, where you have a dominant group, like a majority group, who holds the dominant position in society, and usually
Mm.
most of the positions of like power and influence are from within that population of people. And you have another group that is the you know, the minority group, or the um, I don't exactly mean subservient. I sort of mean subordinate. Um, but you know, you have one group that's on top and one group that's on the bottom,
Yeah.
and so then if this group makes all the decisions, or the people who
Mm.
make the decisions tend to be from this group, then
Mm.
that group's always at the centre, and
Mm.
then the healthcare system serves them pretty well. Like
Mm.
as far as it serves anyone very well, it's, you know, those whose interests are mostly going to be served.
Mm.
Um, and then further out, you know, there's the other people. It's not really working for them, and then you know you see that obviously in like your
Mm.
you know, Māori people die 10 years younger, that sort of thing, but also
Yeah.
across all kinds of health issues. Um, and then in your, yeah, and then in your housing or however, and we
Mm.
have this really competitive rental market.
Mm.
We have this national housing crisis, and the UN is saying sort it out. You can't be having property investment look like how it looks.
Mm.
Why has the New Zealand government encouraged everyone to invest in properties for so long? And now this is where we're at. So it's kind of so in its current format, I guess. Yeah, if you are two adults and you are working and you're getting paid decent, and you know the majority group are more likely to get paid decent money, and
Yeah.
the other group isn't.
Yeah.
So you have to be kind of part of that. You have to be part of that dominant group for it to work for you at all, and even, you know, and of course even within that group, there's a lot of different power differentials and
Mm.
non-equity.
Mm.
So to be able to afford to pay that rent on that house that just fits two adults and 2.5 children, and works if people aren't home most of the time because they're out working. Probably is a bit crowded for everyone to be there all the time, and you can't have any whānau over and all that kind of jazz. And you must have a car to live there, and all that kind of. Um, so so then for the housing, the housing model, yep, working for some people, totally not working for other people. And then I guess across all the areas, when you add all of that up, it means that some people, while there are still people from within the dominant group struggling and having a really hard time for like a lot of different reasons, overall they're having much better life outcomes than the groups that are not at the centre. And I guess like just brings to mind that there's a statistic on trans people and income, which is that in New Zealand the median income for trans people is 50% of the median income for the general population. And so that's across everyone, which includes all the people that don't have any income, and also
Yeah.
people who have lots of income.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, so I guess you can kind of like see how not making things equitable, or not recognizing where things aren't equitable in any particular situation, it also impacts all of the other situations, and yeah, it makes things quite difficult for people. And I guess that's why you have this like Māori people dying 10 years earlier, which is such a huge, that's huge, 10 years of your life. So it's like there's the impacts can be small of centering centering one group when it's your social group, and you're like, we just don't want any boys to come to our movie night. Fine. I think you're allowed that. But yeah.
Yeah. But the bigger you get, the more people that you're trying to survey.
And then I guess you've got like a government level, because it's kind of like you've got all these different sectors, and like you've got your community kind of organisations, like you've got your kind of activist groups and community groups that are not super structured, or maybe sometimes they are. They're not usually got any funding, so they don't have to be externally accountable in any way or that kind of thing. And so you kind of go from there's this really grassroots stuff happening, and interestingly enough, that actually tends to be where people are more focused on getting this stuff right. But you also do see it in pockets, at other levels, and so then you've got your kind of bigger organisations, and and you've got your well-funded organisations, and you've got businesses and etc., the for-profit sector as well, and then you've got your I don't know, like your ministries and your etc. And so it's kind of like at each stage, or on each level, who's at the centre, and who's not at the table. Yeah, I was thinking a little bit, and I was wondering, you've probably had experience with like different kinds of safer spaces issues and accessibility issues and things like that coming up at across different work, and I was thinking how often like valuing the humanity of disabled people, for example, that's pretty central to the safety of disabled people, and not just their feelings, but like their literal safety, of how much danger they're in society, both from policies and things that could kill them, and also violence. And I
Mm.
mean, last time I was
Yeah.
in the hospital, or the time before last, a friend of mine came to visit me, and they are a wheelchair user, and they were like, "Oh, I was really excited about coming to see you," and then I realised this is pretty much the only time when I get to visit people when they're in the hospital because it's wheelchair accessible, and
Yeah.
I was like, "Fucking, yeah, it should not
Yeah.
be like that. Like
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
not
And
that's
that's that
not
housing
okay.
design piece
That's
as well. Hey,
Yeah, yeah.
conservative
And
housing.
even if you
Yeah.
can get a house for yourself, if, which,
Yeah.
is a big if you can get a house that you can live in that's mobility accessible for you, can you visit anyone in your family or any of your friends or go to
Yeah.
any meetings or go to work or, you know,
Yeah.
um, yeah, yeah. And and then there's sort of like what can be done about that stuff.
Mm.
And part of it is having those people involved and at the table,
Mm.
so that you at least know who is there, or
Mm.
or know who isn't there, and
Mm.
but not just like in a oh we'll acknowledge that way, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, in a way that recognizes what's happening and makes sure that that goes into plans on how to make it into your policies that you then can work out how you're gonna, how are we gonna
Mm.
make that policy alive
Mm.
and working and
Yeah. And
yeah.
practical.
Mm.
I love what you're saying because I feel like even if people haven't necessarily, I'm going to talk in quite sweeping statements here. So sorry if this is unfair on anybody because I know lots of people are really trying, but I think um, I think in the general left, a lot of the time the focus is really on um, the people who hold power and how they can be um, behaving more correctly
Mm.
to people who have less power, or people who experience various kinds of oppression. Hey, and that can turn into a thing that is very focused on kind of self-policing and correcting of each other, and you know, I know you know, and and it can get into that sort of performative allyship space and all of that, and become very sort of navel gazing and internal. And while that's all that's going on, that space can still be really alienating to people who want to participate, who experience any of those kinds of oppression, and um, because it, like you say, it's centering the people with power. And I mean, it is a tricky one. Like this is something that I've struggled for myself around areas that I experience power. Is that those of us who experience power do need to think about how we can do something
Yeah, totally.
around that. So
I would.
some thought needs to be put into that. But like you say, if it just focuses on that, then all of the really practical material stuff that needs to happen often doesn't happen, and it just becomes very focused on righteousness sort of thing. Eh? And yeah,
Yeah, I guess like I think it sometimes over focuses on like interpersonal relationships. And
yeah,
like those relationships are important. Like nobody wants to work with a guy who's sexually harassing everyone in the office. Like that's
yeah,
not like that's of course you do have to address those um
mm,
that interpersonal stuff, which is obviously also very political, and
mm,
needs and so you kind of have to have robust policies about what
mm,
is and isn't okay. And I think when you be quite clear about that stuff, then it's easier to just get on with it. To be like, this isn't, this is, and this isn't. And if you do the stuff that isn't okay, this is what process is going to be about it.
mm,
And like this is the behaviour that's expected from you in this space. And whether that's like an employer saying, this is what I expect from you as my employee, you
mm,
don't sexually harass people,
mm,
or whether it's a group or a collective being like, in this collective, we don't do that to each other, and if we're doing that, we need to sort that out, or
yeah,
we're going to have to leave, or
mm,
however that goes.
mm,
Yeah, but I think that yeah, that the stuff that isn't interpersonal stuff often does, does fall off the agenda,
Mm,
or it isn't there in the first place.
mm,
Um, and I guess I'm thinking about a couple of different things. One thing is like, for example, we don't have wheelchair access at the moment, in the place where I work.
mm,
Um, and that would be my job to sort that out. And it's like, we do not have any money, and we've been,
mm,
asking funders, hey, we need money for this, hey, we need money for this, and then, it hasn't happened, and it's like, okay, so what is the cost of that going to be, and
mm,
is it, like, is it something that we can actually do, or something that we literally can't do? Could we
mm,
do it if we just reprioritize some other things?
mm,
Or is it something that there isn't any way that we can do?
mm.
And we run on a very tight budget, but not everybody does.
Yeah,
And so that's a thing as well. And at the end of the
yeah.
day, we're like, cool, our lease is up in 8 months. And in the meantime, we're going to find a place that can be made mobility
Mm,
accessible if it isn't
mm,
already mobility accessible. Because
mm,
it feels terrible to have been in a place for, at that point it'll be 2 years
mm,
that isn't mobility accessible. And like, we can have handrails, and we can have it so that if you can get up a couple of stairs, then it's fine, but
yeah.
it's still. And we can like make sure the lights are not fluoro lights, and we make sure that we're not using air freshener sprays, and there's a lot of
Mm,
things that we can. And just make sure that when people can't come to work because they're having chronic pain issues, or they're having anxiety or whatever,
mm,
that it's covered so that they can stay home, and
mm.
and that also that doesn't put heaps of extra stress on the people who are there, because we've got backup for that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's kind of like you can
yeah.
build in systems that make things more accessible. And like we've definitely had people volunteering and being like, I couldn't work in an op shop before because I was expected to be on my feet the whole day, and pick up
Mm,
things or rearrange shelves, and I'd be in trouble if I was sitting down. But
mm,
here I can sit down behind the counter and
yeah,
wipe the shelves and
yeah,
greet the
yeah, yeah.
customers, and you know so it's like there's stuff that you can do to make things more accessible, even if you can't
Mm,
make things completely accessible.
mm, yeah.
But then also you got to keep that on your agenda. And of course, it would be easier to just stay where we are, kind of,
Mm,
except lots of the staff, including me, have kind of fucked legs, so going
right.
upstairs isn't great for us
Yeah,
either.
right.
Um,
Yeah,
but so it's,
yeah.
but like we could just stay there, but we won't. If we can get another place that we can have mobility access, then that is
Mm,
definitely a priority. So
mm,
it's kind of like there's that like recognizing where um, maybe you can't do exactly what you want to do right now, but you need to know exactly what it is that you want to do, and then like
mm,
where that sits in a list of priorities,
mm.
kind of thing. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and I was also thinking about a treaty workshop that I went to once,
Mm,
and it was pretty good, and there was a lot of people, like smart people who do good socially conscious work that helps people, and good people
mm,
mostly.
mm, yeah.
And um, and so we did the workshop, and we talked about all the sort of history and things. I
Mm,
mean, you can't talk about all the history in a couple of hours,
yeah.
but we talked about things, and then at the end we did an exercise that was how could you bring the treaty into your current work,
Mm,
or if you aren't working as working, then how could you
mm,
bring that into your relationships in your life?
mm,
Um, and there were quite a few Pākehā people there who were before me in the talking order, going around the room to say what we would do,
mm,
and almost all of them said, "Oh, I acknowledge my white privilege," um, and I was like, "Oh, it's interesting to see that happen in action, because I know that it's a thing that people get very,
Mm.
they feel like they are supposed to,
Mm.
I don't mean self-deprecate, but I feel like, they're meant to be like, I acknowledge my personal responsibility, but what we were asked to do was, how could you put the treaty into practice in your workplace or life?
Mm.
And I said, I mean, I wasn't, like the boss of anything, but I was like, like what I think is appropriate to do in a workplace is, look at who is making the decisions in your organisation. Like, does your board have Māori representation, and how much, like, what percentage of your board is Māori, um,
Mm.
in terms of like steering the organisation, and then like, and
Mm.
then the operations people, the people who make the decisions, within the organisation about what's going to happen next. Are there Māori people doing that, involved in doing that at all?
Mm.
Um, so like, looking at making sure that you don't just have like a Māori person on the front desk who, you put in all your photos or whatever. like, but that actually Māori people have
Mm.
an equal say in what's happening in the organisation, because that's how
Mm.
you follow the treaty.
Yeah.
You make it a partnership, and and I think that a lot of the
Mm.
time that those decisions about how to recenter, um, they're really uncomfortable. If you had a plan and you were, I know what I'm doing, this is going to be great, we're going to do this stuff,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
then you have to suddenly co-author that with someone else, and they might have really different priorities,
Mm.
but also that's, I mean, ultimately it makes the project better, or the organization better, or the group better.
Totally.
It's like, and it's like there's corporates have done a lot of research on this,
Mm.
because it improves like how
Yeah.
much, essentially how much money you make in a corporate world, to have a more diverse team.
Yeah.
It's like your team is more functional, has better ideas, and like
Mm.
does better,
Yeah.
when you increase the diversity. So it's kind of like there's no downside to it, except
Mm.
for that some people will have to let go of being in the center,
Yeah.
or have to
And
just
their
step back a
plan,
little bit.
maybe their plans of how it should go. I love how
Mm.
all of this that you're talking about is really about design, at all different levels. Like I think that starting with housing makes that really clear. Like that housing is designed in a particular way by particular people to serve that need, but lots of people aren't served by that. It's a really physical way to get your head around that, and I like that as you're talking, you can see how this idea of who's doing the planning and the designing is at
Mm.
every level and can be brought into every aspect of any project, and
Mm.
and in any way that you have power to do it, kind of thing. And like you say,
Mm.
it doesn't have to be perfect. That issue of funding and people getting like, oh, I can't afford it, I'll just not try at all, throw that out. So I love that you talked about how you can start bringing different things, and even if you can't do it all, and build towards the things that you can't do now. But again, with all kinds of design, even if it isn't physical things like that, I think that people can take that and be really creative with it,
Mm. Mm.
and it makes me think too, like what you're saying about the decision. I read a thing a while ago that said that like groups where people are all the same, they enjoy making decisions more and feel better about the decisions that they've made.
Mm.
People who are all diverse group have a harder time coming to the decision, and don't necessarily feel as sure about the decisions that they've made, but they actually make better decisions,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
because like you say, they're taking more needs and perspectives and stuff into account, and
Yeah.
serving
Totally.
serving a bigger group of people and stuff. So
Yeah, and it's
um,
like doing the work before you make the decision, instead of making the
yeah,
decision and then going,
yeah,
oh.
Ah,
Oh no,
exactly.
we didn't do
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah,
Now we're getting
exactly.
criticized.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh no, I feel
exactly.
cancelled.
Totally, exactly that. And that's the other thing. That reminded me of the other thing that I was thinking while you're talking is that with something like housing, like all the housing that's been built all over Aotearoa, New Zealand and stuff, and you can feel, and it's like built with a particular plan in mind, and then it's like, oh, then you have to sort of either live with it the way it is or kind of alter what's existing, eh? And that's so often the way that people come centering a particular group, come with their plan, and then have to just sort of like with the mentality that they can just tweak it for Māori or tweak it for
Yeah.
whatever, and off like cynically often it's sort of, and I guess I'm thinking more of in the NGO space now, that can be kind of cynically to want to, like you say, put someone on the front desk, sort of put a face on it kind of thing. But I think even, I don't know, thinking of some of the people of colour that I've heard talking on YouTube about leftist leftist YouTube, even like even in the area of ideas, that still happens, where it's kind of like we want to just have the main people who hold power. We're going to have our main idea, and then we just want to have some other diverse group of people saying that idea as well, kind of thing, or saying
Yeah,
something that
yeah.
supports that idea and makes us not have to change the whole way we think about our ideas, sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time the best ideas come from those people. They just don't get credited to those people as well, which
Yeah.
I think there's a I mean, I think there's two ways that happens, and one is intentionally, and the other one is,
Yeah.
accidentally. Um, and I know that when everybody gets excited about an idea, whoever's in charge is the person who's like, okay, right, so this is how we'll do it, or project managers, because that's kind of how that usually goes. Even
Mm.
if you're in a consensus kind of group,
Yeah.
there's usually someone who does the project manager type stuff,
Yeah.
and that person might change. But let's say on this project, someone does the project manager thing,
Mm.
and because they do a lot of thinking out about exactly how that idea will go, then people remember it as their idea, and they might remember it as their idea.
Mm.
But that's also a really important, like, I like that point, like it
Mm.
is important as well to, like, you know um to recognize where the expertise has come from, because it's not always the
Yeah.
people who are getting named the experts.
Totally. Yeah. 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 Totally. That's such a good point. Especially because, like, I mean, it feels more clear when you're talking in the area of health, like in something like sexual violence prevention, like it feels quite clear that there, even if this isn't the intention, there's kind of a bit of an attitude of here's us kind of like white, mostly women who are going to save everyone. And so this is being really glib, but so again, take this with a pinch of salt. And I know lots of people are trying to do good work, but just kind of a vibe that can come across is that here's us kind of white women who are going to save everyone. Mentality of the people who have the power are the ones who can do the good work and know how to do the good work, and the people who will receive that good work are the people who are oppressed, kind of thing, or are suffering, rather than the people who are experiencing whatever shitty structural stuff actually are the ones that know. And um, you know,
People are experts on their own lives,
yeah,
and I guess that when you're in the
yeah,
position of being the if you're in the position of being like the organization that hears all of those experiences for
mm-hmm.
people, then you need to value that's what's happening. And then
Mm.
and I guess I think about how sometimes people come to us and say, can you give us a, I mean, and this has happened across different organizations I've worked at.
Mm.
When I worked at NZPC, people would approach us and say, can you give us a sex worker to come and tell us about what life is like as a sex worker across all of the time, um, and they do it at GMA, and people come and say, can you give us a trans, and it might even be
Mm.
specific, like a trans young person under 25, and it might even be more specific than that. It might be
Mm-hmm.
like very specific to tell us what the experience of trans people is like, and it's sort of like everybody has got valid experiences, and also those experiences are really subjective, and
Mm,
there are common threads. Like, this is not at all to devalue the experiences that they have,
mm,
but if you want to get, so there is a middle person, I think, often necessary between, here are people's raw experiences where they are fucking
mm,
suffering, and they are hurting,
mm,
and they've been wronged, and maybe they've been wronged by, by the health system, or maybe they've been wronged by the police, or maybe they've been wronged by their partner, or it could
mm,
be any type of situation,
yeah.
and they're just having, potentially they're having raw emotional experiences, and also potentially the ways that they know how to talk about that. Maybe
Mm,
they have never had good support. Maybe they've only ever had
yeah,
support that says, "Well, it's your fault. Stop being
yeah.
such a weirdo," or stop being a problem, and you won't get abused, or whatever. So sometimes the ways that they will tell their stories, if that just goes straight to, it's like you need
Yeah.
actually to have an interpreter. Like, you need the person in the
Mm,
middle who hears all of those stories all the time and can be like, yep, cool. I mean, despite that person is saying it was my fault because I did this thing wrong, you're hearing, they got blamed for doing this minor thing, like they dropped a bloody cup on the floor and then they got a punch in the face, and it's like, so you need to have a middle person who understands
the context,
the
eh? And
yeah, yeah, and can
yeah,
interpret that. Um, yeah,
yeah.
and I think
And also like
just
that, I mean, I think lots of things about that. Like for one, that middle person is likely to have support and structures that they can have a conversation like that without it being re-traumatizing or
mm,
demeaning or, whatever else. Whereas taking somebody who is in their raw experience is quite a vulnerable person to be, putting in that position.
yeah,
Yeah. And it also just like, this is a little bit to the side, but it reminds me because like I used to study anthropology, and I remember being at this anthropology conference where where mainstream white anthropologists were getting taken to task a little bit by Māori anthropologists, which was kind of happening for the first time in a while because Māori anthropologists had just gone out of the field, really. That people had taken their talent and gone to education and other fields, and were now re-engaging with anthropology. Um, and this older white anthropologist, I can't remember his name, but he said something like, you know, we're often really good at, or feel, he said we're really good at, maybe he just feels like they're really good at, but we're often really good at engaging with Indigenous people in the field, but not so good at engaging with Indigenous peers, our sort of our academic peers. And I think that kind of is across the board as well, that like people in all kinds of areas, they might, like, white labor focused anarchists might love working with people of color who are experiencing poverty and need support around labor organizing or something, but they might not like working with other leftist Māori or, whatever.
I was saying, I guess it's that power relationship thing again, eh? Like,
Exactly, yeah,
where
yeah.
you are going in as the professional to be like, I'm going to give you all the information, all the options, and you will decide what you want to do, and you will be empowered, and I will have played a role in that. I mean,
Yeah,
best case scenario.
yeah,
I know sometimes it's a lot more, I'm going to save you and fix your problems, and this is what you're going to do.
yeah,
But,
yeah,
it's like, and I think, yeah, okay, so for a lot of people, it feels emotionally gratifying
mm,
to be able to help someone with a problem, and
mm,
for that person to be like, this is changing my life, thank you.
yeah,
Like,
for
that
sure.
can feel
Yeah,
really good, but
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
but it isn't enough, because also, if you're running on a saving framework,
Mm,
it's not ultimately empowering. Like, you can do useful things and that's still good, but
mm,
I don't know, like, I always think about how we try to, when someone comes to us with, here's my problem, we try to say, this is the information that we have about that problem, and there are these different options, and maybe it's, maybe this option's going to take a year to sort out, but it might
Mm.
have a really good outcome. This one here will get you sorted quickly. It's not going to be perfect, and
Mm.
there's this other route that's totally left field that you can try if you want to, or whatever,
Mm.
um, so that they are choosing what they want to do. We're just giving them information and saying these are what the options are, and you might not have known about some of those options.
Yeah, yeah.
And often people are still like, oh my god, you've changed my life, that's amazing, which is fine, but we have to always make sure that that's not what we're there to get.
Mm.
And then I guess bringing it back to your colleagues, it's like you don't have that power relationship with
Yeah.
them. And I have found that so many times in different groups over my life that, like
Mm.
maybe you join up with some collective or some group and you're like, yay, this is amazing, this is so great, and we're writing all these good policies and we have all these good, whatever, we've got all these good plans and we're doing good stuff.
Mm.
But then as soon as you are at the point within that group where you understand how it all works, and then you start to say to whoever's in charge, hey,
Mm.
maybe we could try doing it this other way, or like, oh, maybe we should get everyone's input on that, or like, oh, you kind of agreed that we weren't going to do this thing, the group made this decision and then you changed it, and I know that you're in charge kind of, but like, it's the group's decision or whatever.
Yeah.
Then suddenly they don't want to work with you, and it's like, it's
Mm.
almost like you become a threat or something like that.
Mm.
So it's like
Totally.
if you have equal standing, then you're a threat,
Yeah, yeah.
and that happens, I think, both when the people who are in charge aren't actually behaving well towards everyone else, and so someone being in a position to challenge them actually is a threat to them,
Mm.
because maybe other people would rather that someone else was in charge, and so if there's
Mm.
someone else that
Mm.
could be, it's a
Mm.
threat to their position.
Mm.
And then I think it also
Which is
comes
quite an
down.
extreme escalation, eh? But I can,
Yeah.
but people can feel that threat. Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then I think the other thing is just uh, oh, I
Sorry.
guess I was just thinking about when it's not that they're misbehaving. It's not that they're behaving badly towards other people or anything. It's just that like I've been in Hui with like awesome people, people that I love, where it comes down to everyone's trying to talk about the different plan or the different model or the different thing that they want to do. Um, and let's say for simplicity, everybody's got a different shape that they're trying to say, this is the shape we should
Right. Yeah.
use, or whatever. I want the circle and I want the square.
Yeah.
And then if it comes down to a couple of us and we are equally persuasive or equally like charismatic, I mean, I wouldn't call myself. I'm saying, oh yeah, I can see why your circle's good because I like the round edges and it's compact and it won't dig into your pocket. But also doesn't quite fit as much in as if you get a square one or something like that. And we're arguing. We're not arguing, but we're just like, oh yeah, I can see your points, but I think this one's a better one.
Yeah.
And then maybe the group doesn't come to a decision, and I think, if I wasn't there, and maybe I say this at the time as well, that like, that I'm happy to go with the other one if that's what everybody thinks. I personally prefer this one, but like, it's cool. But then I think that you can have those types of situations where it just creates a bit of tension between people who perhaps occupy or may occupy a similar-ish position, or may have potential to occupy a similar-ish position.
Oh, leadership. You're talking about a sort of.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
Whether that relates directly to like, oh, there's a job going and someone's going to apply for
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
or whether it just relates to like,
Yeah. Personal dynamic
being,
stuff or whatever. Yeah.
yeah. So even when there's like nobody's doing anything wrong, everybody's everybody's top-notch people, and have a really good personal relationship with each other and a good professional relationship, and nothing's wrong. There can still be like a I guess just difficulties with that stuff.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's a level of like interpersonal dynamics are so very multifaceted, and we all have our really different histories
Mm.
and the struggles that we might have been through to get to where we are, or all different kinds of um,
Mm.
factors going on. Um,
Mm.
and I feel like coming back to kind of who who gets centered or who decides who gets centered.
Mm.
Um, Probably the most tricky times to have those, like like you were saying about a more diverse group having a more difficult time getting to a decision because of
Mm.
needing to take in so many different things. I think that there's a lot that you have to be able to give it a lot of time. Ideal. And maybe like, and also maybe some people are going to be like, this is my ideal, and some other people are going to be like, this is my second best. But like,
Mm.
of course, that's also life. Like you
Mm.
compromise, you
Mm.
compromise, and you find things that work, and hopefully you work with people who you have a trusting relationship with, so you can see where, you know, you can see where doesn't need to be put in the words that you would use, but it's essentially the same message, or that sort
Mm.
of thing.
Mm.
I was thinking like a little bit earlier on about how so like non-discrimination, or like centering minorities, which I guess is another way to put it, even
Mm.
without non-discrimination, is a good idea, and accessibility is a good idea and things, but also you sometimes have to be very explicit about what that means, and I think
Yeah.
that's a really important part of like developing a good policy. Because if not everybody can understand it, then it's not
Mm.
working. So you can have your kind of high level concepty stuff, but actually that needs to be in in plain language. It needs to be that
Mm.
that the policy itself is accessible. so
Yeah.
um, so it's like the opposite of my personal experience with Marxists trying to teach me Marxism, where I'm like, you're talking about class, but you're talking about it like I've been to university and I know all the jargon you're talking about, and that's not the case. Um,
Mm.
so you want it to be really accessible and really accessible language, and
Yeah. Can you give a little bit of an example of that, like what that looks like at that more real level kind of thing?
yeah. I mean, actually, I think examples are really useful a lot of the time, and they don't
Totally.
fit really succinctly into a policy. But
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
you can always call them a case study and put them on as a take them on at
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
But
Totally. That's such a good point because I often find that my brain doesn't necessarily connect very well to policy report kind of language, but
yeah,
stories or anything that has people that I can draw some meaning from is really helpful for me. So,
yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's like it's like the example of the houses not being,
mm.
like being built with certain people in mind, certain demographics, and the sorts of families they usually have, and the
Mm.
lifestyles they live, and so I guess like specifics of like a safer spaces or diversity policy or whatever really depends entirely on what it's for. Like
Yeah.
if it's for a workplace, then there's a whole lot of stuff that's like legally, like legally there is a requirement. You cannot discriminate legally
Mm.
against, rainbow people or ethnic minorities, or like there's lots of religion, and there are
Mm.
many and so like the laws, people's policies, and I think this is the case with like Rainbow Tick, for example, their
Mm.
policies on rainbow inclusion to get the tick that says you're doing it well, does not meet the same standard that the law requires. So like the law should be the minimum standard for not discriminating against people and for
Mm.
treating people fairly.
Mm.
And when I say the law should be the minimum standard, I really mean that. Like, I think
Mm.
we could do a lot better. Um,
Mhm.
so there's kind of, yeah, whereas like if you're a group of friends who's doing something together, then you probably don't need to worry about what the law says about it.
Yeah.
And also if you're talking about coming into people coming into your space, like your activist centre or your marae or your office or whatever, then it's all got to be framed around what happens in that physical space.
Mm.
Whereas if you're, organising a camping weekend, then you got to frame your policy, and I mean, like the group might exist. You might be framing it around
Mm.
the group itself as opposed to where you are or what you're doing, and that kind of thing. So it is really variable, but
Yeah.
short examples like if you are running a conference and you know that there are people at that conference who are fleeing domestic violence, or who are maybe they have overstayed on a temporary visa, or they might be in some type of situation, or they might be like a gay kid who's not out to their family or whatever. If you've got people who will have a privacy concern, like a very real privacy risk,
Mm-hmm.
then like your safer spaces policy needs to be specific, that like one of the things that it requires is there is absolutely no photos and no filming within
Mm-hmm.
within that conference or whatever. So it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like your safer spaces policy can look like very specific things, depending
Mm-hmm.
on what the group needs.
Mm. That's a really great
Uh,
example.
mm,
Mm.
cool.
That's a really great example,
Yeah.
because I think that an example like that too, like shows that, because you're talking about like these various groups of people might be there and might be exposed by those photos, but I think there's a flip side to that, that those people might just not come to
Yeah.
a conference if there's going to be photos. So it's sort of like,
Yeah.
I think
It's
there's,
what funders want to see.
yeah,
Whoever's funding you wants to see
yeah,
photos
yeah,
of everyone
yeah,
having a good time. But also there are ways around that.
yeah,
You can say we have a no photos policy, but we're getting a photographer, and it doesn't have to be a professional photographer.
yeah,
And we're gonna have a photo booth or a group photo at the end or whatever, and then make that very
yeah.
clear when that's going to happen. No photos outside of
Mm,
that. If you want
mm,
to get photos, if it's a fun party event, then like go in the photo booth and take cool photos. Or if
yeah,
it's however. So it's like
yeah,
you can get around that stuff.
yeah,
Same I guess with, yeah, I mean I guess lots of things. Like if you're doing something that is catered, you
mm,
want to make sure everybody can eat, because
yeah,
eating is really important. And
yeah,
there's so much eating disorder, feelings about bodies, or feelings about taking up resources, or you
yeah,
know, or feelings about seen to be doing something that's not social etiquette, or
mm,
there's lots of things that are going on with
mm,
people. So you want there to be food that everyone can eat, that everybody's happy to eat and will enjoy, and that they won't feel pressured to eat if they're trying to discreetly not eat it,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and that nobody's gonna be that they're not gonna be um, getting social judgment for eating lots, or
mm,
for
mm,
showing up and being hungry. And I
mm,
think
mm,
we went to like our work crew went to Stillwaters a little while ago, which is like a commune in the city, and they do like free dinners on Fridays, and they do lots of different kinds of homeless services, and
yeah,
or just like helping people out with stuff. They're like a faith-based commune,
yeah,
and one of our staff was like living there and working there as well.
yeah,
So and he was like, come, come, and we were like, oh yeah, one day, and then we did,
yeah,
and it was really nice. Um, it was, so we went along there and had chats with whoever showed up at the time for our feed, and then we got our food, and and there was like pots of food and things outside on the tables as well, so you could dish yourself up.
mm,
And we got our food, and then we were sitting down and eating, and lots of people were coming in, and they were clearly hungry, and they weren't trying to hide that they were hungry. They were like, oh, mean, mince. I'm going to get a whole plate of mince
Yeah.
and eat as much as I possibly can real
Yeah.
fast. And I'm like, yeah, that's what happens when you're hungry and you don't know where your next meal's coming from. That's exactly how you eat. And like,
Mm.
fuck social graces and trying to not look like you're hungry. But I think that a lot of the time, a lot of us are operating on these social politeness rules where you're meant to not be hungry, you're meant to not have needs. When you're busting to go to the bathroom, you don't walk into a meeting and say, where's your bathroom? You sit down and suffer, you know, for at least a while, and then you go to the bathroom. Or, you
Yeah.
know, you're
Yeah.
hungry
Yeah.
and there's crackers and salmon, you don't just go and eat 10 of them, but you could because you are hungry and it should be alright, you know.
Yeah.
Body is a
Yeah.
soft animal, like this needs care, you know. It's a very like, bodies like to be bathed and toileted and fed, and if you and, you know, and slept, and if you don't give them those
Yeah.
things, well, stink. It's like looking after a child and not doing that for them. So like, do that for your body. But
Yeah.
yeah, but all that
Excellent,
kind of
just your
social
self
grace
care
stuff.
point for this channel, because I think a lot of people who are you know working on things that are important to them forget to take care of ourselves in those ways.
Yeah,
As well.
yeah, totally. Myself included.
Yeah.
Totally. It's
Yeah.
a yeah, guilty.
Yeah.
But I guess I was thinking about how how in that space it was completely fine and nobody looked at anybody funny for showing up starving, dishing up a huge meal. Maybe they couldn't even eat it all, but like everybody gets it because, like, you know,
Yeah.
that's life when you're sleeping rough or
Yeah.
just having a rough time with getting your needs met.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so you want to make sure that,
Mm.
you know, in every situation that you're running or organising, which takes a lot of thinking, which takes a lot of
Does.
time, but it's
Yeah.
like, you know, you got to have that time to think. Well, if we, you know, if we give everybody, you know, a goodie bag with lollies, and then some people can't eat sugar and some people can't eat gelatin, and you know, blah 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 blah. It's kind of like, and it seems like minutia, but it makes people have a really different experience of feeling valued. And,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. And like they belong in
yeah.
it, that they can be in that place and belong there, and yeah, that it's for them. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Mm.
Yeah, and a lot of that stuff, I mean, you know, it depends on the size of the group and whether or not it's a group of people who come together regularly, so you know what each other needs, or it's a, you know, it's a group of strangers coming to an event or something. But like planning for all that stuff, for the mobility access and the, you know, do you need interpreters? Do you need, you know, sign language, interpreters, many things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the more that you can plan for all those things, the more that your event or your group or whatever goes really smoothly, and then hopefully the worst issues that you have to deal with are, you know, to do with the difficulty of doing whatever work it is you've come together to do. And I think like I mean, attendees of things having a bad time, that's, you know, that's a serious issue. But I think the more common serious issue that happens in, you know, in the kind of activisty, voluntary, NGO, you know, low pay, etc., that whole group of
Yeah.
groups, I think the common thing is that, you know, it's the people who are organising it that don't feel supported and that have a really stressful time, and maybe they manage to hold it all together so that everyone who comes to the event, or who, you know, who whatever the thing is, has a really good time, and, you know, has a good time and experiences personal growth or whatever they've come together to do, and doesn't have a shit time. But, you know, like looking after your crew, or your crew looking after itself, is like, because a lot of the stressful stuff often falls on one or two people, and also also a lot of the stress, I think, often falls on the people who are more used to living with high stress and therefore can keep their cool more in high stress situations. which is, which isn't to say people who can't don't live with stress. Like I know
Yeah.
anybody, I don't know anybody who doesn't live with a lot of stress, but I
Yeah.
think there's a tendency to have a lot of the last minute work, or a big drama has just happened, or a big fight or something, and someone has to come in and do the emotional labour,
Mm,
making sure that everybody is okay. And
mm,
who's going to do that, and who do people trust to do that, and like,
yeah.
where does that work fall, and all that kind of,
Yeah.
um, especially in soft skills, I think a part of like, you know, equitable division of labour,
Mm,
and a part of equity in an organisation or a group, or and having those policies that are there to create that equity, or to try to show where there isn't that equity, and make it so that you can plan to make that equity, so that
mm,
there isn't all this power imbalance,
mm,
or so that that power imbalance isn't having a big effect, as big of an effect in that space or whatever. Um, but yeah, part of that can be like who all the the shit jobs fall on. Who has to do all the
yeah.
yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and I think about all the times when the things that fall off the list of things to do, and it might be who cleans the toilet. That's not in anyone's job description. And it might be who organised the childcare for this conference.
Mm,
That didn't happen. So the people who show up and do it are often the people who are like, oh no, it's cool. I raised 10 nieces at home, you know, and so I've got a DVD player and a bubble wand in my backpack, and but then it's like, well, then who's missing out on
yeah.
what they came for, and
Yeah.
those extra jobs often end up falling on people they shouldn't.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, I think this probably goes without saying, but I'll just say it out loud that so often, like, I think the subtext here too is that so often people who have experienced harder lives and more oppression in their lives, and often have had. I mean, you might come from a very privileged background and still have a very fucked family dynamic where you take on that sort of looking after everybody's needs role. But so often, people who experience forms of oppression across all kinds of things are more equipped, to deal with shit because
Yeah.
they've been dealing with shit.
Yeah.
That's yeah. And so
Yeah.
yeah, people who experience more privilege less likely to be able to, are more often less likely to be able to step up to that kind of last minute. Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the things. I was having a conversation last week with somebody about, about the issues with self-evaluation tools, and it was in a healthcare kind of context, like
Mm,
evaluating how much you need a service, and then someone else evaluates how much they need the service, and then only one of you gets it.
mm,
To micro scale it. That if you're used to living with chronic pain every day, then you rate your pain as it's only about a 2.
mm,
And if you're used to like a off the charts 15 on stress, then you might rate your stress as 5 instead of
yeah,
the maximum,
yeah,
because you're
yeah,
not maximum stressed right now. And the person who's like, I tried to get a doctor appointment, and they haven't even called me back, and it's been 2 days, and I'm outraged, and I'm going to see a lawyer about it.
yeah,
And maybe they're not living with that chronic pain, and they're not,
mm-hmm,
and they're willing to rate their stress really high because they have
mm-hmm,
not had to deal with the same sorts of levels of stress, and so
mm-hmm,
then it looks like they're the one that needs it more, and maybe they're not, and
yeah,
so it's tricky with that.
yeah.
Which I guess is what happens informally when you're not rating your stress to get a medical treatment as well.
You're just venting about your stress so that you can work out who does what at the conference. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You show up and you say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have to self-care because you know, um,
Mm,
I don't know, because everything's really hard in my life right now." And then,
mm,
and then what does that look like? And
Yeah.
and it should be okay, but it's just that who picks up that work, and
Yeah.
is it the same people who are willing to deal with the most stress all the time because they live lives
Yeah.
that are work is a fucking holiday, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, in some ways, like, that's a fucking awesome skill. Like, that's that's something to be celebrated, to be able to do that. But it can't be that all the time, and there needs to be
Yeah.
some kind of support, to like care for the people who are doing that all the time and
Yeah.
ease their load in
Yes.
other ways, and also acknowledging it, because so often those
Yeah.
things go unacknowledged, and so then it's still like at the next meeting it's like, well, we need to share this work out evenly or whatever, rather than being
Yeah.
like, well, you did heaps, so you could just chill for a while.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. 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 Totally. Yeah, because it's like people can have their you know, and I know that personal boundaries about not taking on more work is, you know, like a hard thing to learn,
Yeah,
when you're passionate about something and you know it needs to be done and you have the
yeah,
skills to do it.
yeah,
Saying no to emails on the weekend and not going to speak at that thing someone asked you to do,
yeah,
and you know
yeah,
all that kind of jazz.
yeah, yeah.
Unless you want to do it, like
Yeah,
that's
I was gonna say, I should say that he's talking about the
that was
weekend,
not passive aggressive.
right? Last minute as well.
But it's like, you know, it's like those are all important skills to have, but also any group A needs to be able to like acknowledge what's happening and appreciate, you know, appreciate that it's happening.
Yeah,
And I think that's heaps of it, eh? Because if it's
yeah,
when it doesn't get noticed or it doesn't get appreciated, um, then people feel like there's no point, or they feel used,
yeah,
eh? That's
yeah,
kind of
totally.
like,
Yeah, yeah. And especially, I think
um,
that there can be such that dangerous combination, like especially if we're talking about people who experience forms of oppression, that dangerous combination of doing all of that extra invisible work, plus not being as involved in the decision making, or you know,
mm,
the perspective that is being brought to decisions is not understood or valued or whatever. So like
mm,
that's a fucking recipe for burnout. Eh?
mm,
Like,
mm. Yep, totally.
mm,
Yep. I mean, there's huge value, I think, in kind of parallel leadership models, um, where even if there is somebody who is project managing or who is the employer or you know whatever,
mm,
even if there is actually a power hierarchy on who has the responsibility and has to make the final calls and
mm,
also gets to make the final calls, there's still like such a big value in like putting real time and effort into valuing everybody's contributions and into like,
mm,
you know, understanding everyone's perspectives
mm,
and I wonder how much as well that stuff is to do with situating yourself if you are in a position of power, like acknowledging, not being like, I'm not really your landlord, but you know, you just pay my mortgage off and whenever I want. No, you have responsibilities because you are the landlord, legal. If you are the person in charge, if you are the boss, or if you are, you know, the project manager, or you're responsible for something,
mm,
then like acknowledging that you do have, you know, that even if you don't have a whole lot of structural systemic power,
mm,
that in this particular setting, you know, that you do make the final calls, and that means
mm,
being really sensitive to what everybody else is bringing to the table, and just making sure that actually everybody's input is valued and is
mm,
being worked into things, and it's not just yeah, that's a cool idea maybe, and
mm.
never unless I decide it was my idea, you know, etc.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think it's like just now as you were talking, and I was finding it really interesting. I was like, I think it's funny that we thought maybe we could do like a little short half hour or something. 'Cause, like, I always really enjoy talking to you, and I don't think we've ever had a half hour conversation. But thank you, thank you for sharing your great brain with us. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you also.